Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
And welcome in to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, BSP Brandon Soder-Penner. And man, do we have a packed show for you guys today. I'm very excited to dive into this. Going to start you off with the 5 burning questions for today's episode. Right after that, going to get into the wide receiver previews for both the AFC and NFC South. And then I'm going to round everything off today with my top 10 late round PPR targets. These are guys that for specifically your PPR league, you're going to be able to get after pick number 200 and are still going to be able to either contribute value week in and week out or are solid enough lottery tickets to where you need to be picking them somewhere late in your draft. Now, guys, if I sound a little more excited than usual, it's because I am. So if you follow me on Twitter, you already know where this is going. But as you all know, a couple episodes ago, I had to miss one of the postings because I said I had a family emergency to attend to, which was true. It was something that we weren't necessarily expecting to happen given the circumstances. However, I am thrilled to announce that me and my wife Amber are now expecting our first child. We got married back in November, and again, this kind of came as a surprise, but we were kind of of the attitude of, you know, whatever happens, happens. And yeah, we don't know anything about the gender or anything like that yet, but we're expecting our first child to arrive sometime in February of this year. So again, I'm very ecstatic, very excited to be a dad, and I'm blessed that at this point in my life that I've got an amazing wife to come home to every day, a supportive wife to come home to, and then now our first child at the beginning of next year. So I'm very excited, guys. I'm glad I finally got to announce it with you all. We were waiting just to make sure that everything was okay before we started making things public. But yeah, so enough about that, guys. Let's go ahead and start talking football. I know that's why you're all here. Before we get into the fantasy questions for today's episode, a couple pieces of news did come down over the last couple of days, the biggest of which is the Jamal Adams trade. Jamal Adams, the disgruntled Jets safety, arguably a top 3 safety in the league, finally got his wish and got moved out of New York. So what's even crazier than Adams leaving, which I think we were all starting to expect a little bit, it was the haul that the Jets were actually able to get back for him. Now, before I dive into this, Jamal Adams had no leverage here. The Jets had no leverage. Everybody knew that Adams wanted out, and they needed to dump him. If he played this year in New York, he was going to make things miserable for everybody. That all being said, this is what they were still able to get. Now, this is all according to Adam Schefter of ESPN. The Jets are sending Jamal Adams and a 2022 fourth-rounder in exchange for Bradley McDougald, who's a backup safety in Seattle, a first-round pick in 2021, a third-round pick in 2021, and a first-round pick in 2022. Jamal Adams just commanded 2 first-rounders, and at this point, they haven't even put in a structure to re-sign him. At least at the time that I am recording this podcast, the Seahawks aren't even guaranteed to keep him long-term. So as frustrating as it is, I'm sure as a Jets fan, to see good players constantly getting booted out the door while they're still under contract, man, you guys got a freaking steal here. And I'm going to dive more into the fantasy impact of this trade in a few questions here, but obviously I had to get that piece of news out. Jamal Adams, now a member of the Seattle Seahawks. Other piece of fantasy news, and this could be huge, guys. We're waiting on confirmation, and I'm waiting to get excited until after I actually see him show up. But there are reports surfacing that Dalvin Cook, the Minnesota running back who was thought to be holding out for a new contract, is expected to show up to training camp. Now, if you've been listening to the show, you know that me, along with other fantasy experts, have been very hesitant when it comes to ranking Dalvin Cook high because we just weren't sure if he was going to show up for the season or if he was going to miss a significant amount of games while he was holding out for this contract. But if he shows up to training camp, that signifies that he is going to play this season, that the holdout is at least going to end temporarily, or that a deal is getting put together. Whatever the case may be, if he's in training camp, that is a great sign for fantasy owners, and then you can comfortably pick Dalvin Cook somewhere in your top 6 running backs at that point, depending on how you feel about him. But he is a definite top guy as long as he's on the field. The only reason I have been fading him is because of this contract situation. So, again, potentially very exciting news for fantasy owners. If you've already drafted Dalvin Cook while this craziness was going on, you might have snuck him out at a much later pick than he is really worth because of the situation. So congratulations if you fall into that category. All right, so with our news out of the way, without further ado, it is the 5 burning fantasy questions for today's episode. Now, as always, guys, we would love to get your fantasy questions to answer as you start getting your drafts fired up. What do you need to know to be successful going into the 2020 NFL season? Let us know, guys. You can find the show at GSMC_FFootball. That's on Twitter. And then you can also find my personal Twitter page at LaMachine17. Again, at LaMachine17. And it's fantasy questions, guys. We also like some of the off-the-wall ones, too. I'm going to hit one of those every episode. If you want to know what the best brand of potato chips is, if you want me to rank my baby names, whatever it is, guys, I'm willing to dive into it for you. Again, find us at GSMC_FFootball and at LaMachine17. Simply just mention us in a comment, DM us directly, let us know what your fantasy questions are. All right, I had a different number 1, but since I just talked about it, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. So it was originally my 4th question, but number 1, how far does your ranking for defenses go now that Jamal Adams is a member of the Seattle Seahawks? And I'm here to tell you guys, it doesn't move at all, right? All right, so the defense is already sitting at about 18. They weren't great. Yes, Jamal Adams, top-tier safety in the league, but guys, this defense is not good. It's him, Bobby Wagner, and everybody else, right? And on top of that, their strength of schedule is absolutely atrocious, right? You might be able to stream them a couple times. They play Washington, but outside of that, listen to this. Non-conference schedule, they're playing Atlanta, Dallas, and Minnesota. 2 of those have incredibly high-powered passing offenses, and then Minnesota will also be able to put points up on you. And then just within their division, they've got to play Los Angeles, Arizona, and the 49ers twice. Those are all dangerous offenses. This division as a whole has been getting better year in and year out. And this defense is going to be a real Achilles heel, even though they added Jamal Adams. He's only going to be able to have so much of an impact. And I see the score getting run up on Seattle quite a bit this year. They're going to be able to hang in games because their offense is that good. They have Russell Wilson. But from a defensive fantasy perspective, that's going to kill you. Now, the good news is, since they are going to be throwing a lot, you guys like Russell Wilson, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, they're going to get plenty of work for you, and subsequently, they're also going to have fantastic fantasy value because of that. So I'm not sold on the Seattle Seahawks defense. I'm really not sold on them as a team as a whole. I've seen people bounce around the idea that, especially with the addition of Adams, they're Super Bowl contenders. But that division is just way too tough this year. Even with that additional spot, it's going to be very difficult to make the playoffs for them in 2020. So enough of this Seahawks. I'm going to jump to my original first question now. So there's 2 big-name tight ends right now in Philadelphia, and that's Zach Ertz and that's Dallas Goedert. And the question here is, which one do you want to be targeting in your dynasty drafts? And I'm here to tell you, I think I've brought it up once or twice, I'm not incredibly high on Zach Ertz this year. So just looking back a year ago, even though his fantasy numbers were really good, he was not efficient in the slightest, guys. He was targeted 135 times and only hauled in 88 of those passes. And that's with Carson Wentz, right? And on top of that, watching these two guys next to each other, I think Goddard is the more talented tight end right now. The reason that Ertz keeps putting up numbers is just because of his pure volume hogging. However, I think Goddard's going to take over this job sooner than people realize. I think it's Ertz's job for the majority of this year. Goddard's going to cut into it a little bit, but I wouldn't be wholly surprised if Goddard was the starting tight end there in 2021. Ertz is on the last year of his deal, and considering the production that he's had over the last 5 or 6 seasons, he's going to command a lot of money, and I don't know if that's necessarily something that Philadelphia is going to want to invest in a 30-year-old player, especially when they have Goddard already in the wings for them. And just one last thing, I mentioned the volume. The volume's not going to quite be there this year. Philadelphia had all kinds of injuries with their wide receivers last year. They have a couple of guys starting the season in Jalen Reagor and Deshaun Jackson that are going to command some of those targets. So 135 targets, that's going to come down, and I think subsequently his fantasy production is going to come down as well. So I'm fading him pretty hard already in standard. And again, when it comes to dynasty, I'm considering taking Dallas Goedert over him, especially if I'm in the mindset of winning over the next 3 years and not just going into dynasty to try to win right away. So giving Dallas Goedert in dynasty drafts right now, Zach Ertz, the number 4 tight end, man, it's rich. The problem with the tight ends this year is you really have 3 guys at the top, and then I see a pretty significant drop-off with everybody else. So unless you're getting a Travis Kelce, a George Kittle, or a Mark Andrews, I think you're much better off just waiting and snagging a tight end that you like much later on in the draft, because guys like Ertz and Evan Ingram and Rob Gronkowski are just going to be woefully overdrafted this year. Right, now speaking of drafts, this was an interesting question. Where is your favorite spot to draft? So what I mean by that is you go into your fantasy snake style draft, you like to have the first pick, and then when you come back around, you're not picking for 23 spots later. Do you like to pick somewhere in the middle and have a balanced team? I feel like I'm in the minority here. I actually like picking at the turn, guys. I like having that 12th pick, which then, of course, gets you the 13th as well. There's just something about that security of knowing that you're going to be able to nab 2 guys in a row, and you're not really thinking about getting sniped nearly as much, because then you have this large period of time before your next cluster of picks where, again, then you get 2 guys in a row again. Just being able to snag a couple of solid running backs in round 1, round 2, or a solid running back and one of the top 3 wide receivers. There's just a lot of talent that's still going to be available for you there, and you're going to have a lot more control. Now, a couple of the other positions, like having the number 1 pick is great, but you've got a lot of pressure on you to where you have to pick the best guy for the year, which a lot of people are taking Christian McCaffrey, and if you are to take him, and like if what I've been saying comes true and he doesn't play for a lot of the season, then you're going to look really bad, and the rest of your team is going to suffer because you're not going to have another pick for 23 picks, right? You've got the top guy, and then you're going to be getting a lot of leftovers when the draft finally falls back to you. I'd rather even have like the second or third option, honestly, because then the draft is falling to you a little bit, and you don't have that pressure of taking the top guy. But I love the turn. A lot of people don't, because a lot of good players are coming off the board already. But, man, just having 12 and 13 and being able to cluster your picks throughout the rest of the draft, very huge fan of that. Definitely my preferred drafting spot. Now, number 3. Actually, I guess this would be number 4, guys. I'm so sorry. I forgot that I skipped ahead a little bit here. So this is the 4th fantasy question for today, and that's which backup running backs can produce as more than handcuffs. So when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about receiving backs that kind of have a role cut out for them, guys like Tariq Cohen, James White, more of like the traditional running backs that even though they are clearly not the starter, can still have some solid fantasy value for you. So I've listed out my top 3, and at honorable mention, I have Tony Pollard. Now, His ADP is 135, so he's not being drafted as an everyday starter for the most part, but I have heard plenty of experts talk about the fact that he has ability to produce on his own, that he had a role cut out for him in the offense last year, and Mike McCarthy is a head coach that likes to utilize more than one running back. But looking at their roster in 2020 with Zeke in front of him and now a wide receiver core with three very talented guys, I don't think the running back touches are going to be nearly as available as people seem to think, and all the ones that are available are going to go right to Elliott. So into the top three, my number 3 guy is going to be J.K. Dobbins. His ADP is sitting around 99 right now, and he'd be higher on this list if Mark Ingram didn't at least have a little bit left in the tank. He's good enough to where he's going to fend off Dobbins for the majority of the year. I think by the end of the year, J.K. Dobbins is going to take over, but that will limit his fantasy value as a whole. He might be someone that you are going to use a lot when the fantasy playoffs come around, but he doesn't get higher up this list just because it's going to be a while before you see him get workhorse back touches. Number 2, Latavius Murray. They seem to utilize Murray a lot like they do Alvin Kamara. He is used in the passing game, and he is a solid running back. So not only is he a threat to take over if Alvin Kamara is to be injured, but it seems like they've already written him into the game plan quite a bit. So his value skyrockets if Kamara goes down. But at ADP 112, I think he's a guy that you can set at the end of your flex, or if you've got like a deeper league, and can still produce for you every week. And then number 1, guys, it's Kareem Hunt. You've heard me talk about him already. He is a great red zone presence, and the more I looked into it, Nick Chubb really isn't that great around the red zone. He gets the majority of his points in the open field, and when he does score, it's from further out. When you're talking about touches on the 5-yard line or closer, Kareem Hunt is incredibly efficient for running back. So he's going to get plenty of goal line touches, and he's going to be utilized in the passing game as well. Kareem Hunt will be used all over the field, and that drags Nick Chubb's value down quite a bit. And it's going to shoot Hunt's up to the point where he could realistically finish as a top 20 running back in the 2020 season. So just incredible value, especially for a backup. All right, guys, and the last question, you know the last one is always a little more off the wall. Last episode, I gave you my predictions for the Major League Baseball season, as that has officially finally opened up. So this episode, I figured it was time to give my NBA predictions. NBA finally tips off on Thursday, July 30th, so this will be my last podcast before everything gets underway. So I'm going to do it the same exact way I did baseball. I'm going to start with the teams that will make the playoffs in the East and the West. This was a little bit easier for the NBA since they already have the bubble deal going on, and there's only so many teams that can make the playoffs at this point. And I don't think there's going to be a ton of shakeup. Like the extra teams that they invited, a lot of them are just a little bit too far out to really make an impact. So here's what I've got right now. In the East, no surprise, the Bucks are going to get the top seed, and then in order, going from 2 to 8, it's going to be the Raptors, the Boston Celtics, Miami Heat, Philadelphia 76ers, the Indiana Pacers, who did drop a spot just because I'm not sure about Victor Oladipo. We know he's going to play in the playoffs now, but he may not play in any of the games before that. So I think they drop a spot or two. And then the Magic and the Nets. You got the Wizards in there too. They're just too far back. And even if they do get into that play-in game that they were talking about, I really don't see them having enough talent to make a lot of noise there. And then over in the West, again, not a lot of surprises here. Number 1, Lakers, Denver Nuggets, Los Angeles Clippers, Utah Jazz, Houston Rockets, Dallas Mavericks, the Grizzlies, who I like a lot going forward. Ja Morant seems like he's going to be an absolute stud. And then the Thunder. Despite their best efforts, I don't think Zion and the New Orleans Pelicans are going to have quite enough to shoot themselves up into the playoffs. So not going to go into each individual playoff matchup, but I think the finals, it's finally Giannis's year out of the East. He doesn't have anyone of significant note in his way. The Raptors are still a good team. The Celtics have talent, but there's just not enough there to slow down Giannis. He's slowly taking over that crown as the best player in the league. You might see him take that within a year or two now. So love the Bucks out of the East. And then in the West, guys, you talk about having veterans on a team that are going to be able to pull through even with something crazy happening like Corona and the bubble restart. It's the Lakers, right? LeBron James, he's been there, done that. This is just another year for him. So I think he quite easily gets his team into the finals. Clippers are going to put up a fight in the Western Conference Finals, but when all is said and done, Bucks, Lakers have the experience. They have LeBron James. Bucks have a lot of youth. They've got good pieces, but it's not going to be enough to take down LeBron. And I see the Lakers taking this in 5. LeBron James walks away with his 4th NBA championship. So there you have it, guys. Those are the 5 burning questions for today's episode. Remember, stick around for the end today as I give you my top 10 late-round PPR targets. And when we come back, we will dive into the AFC and NFC South wide receiver rooms. So you are listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. Last segment covered the Jamal Adams trade that shook the league over these last couple of days as he heads out to Seattle. And then, of course, answered your 5 burning fantasy questions for today's episode. So moving on, it's time to continue with our wide receiver preview series. Last week went over the NFC and AFC East. Of course, already covered the North divisions for you. And then this week, going to tackle the NFC and AFC South. Now, I am going to do this slightly different. If you've been paying attention, I typically do the NFC divisions first, and then the second segment will then dive into the AFC. However, when I looked at this, guys, the NFC South is probably my favorite division when it comes to wide receivers, and it should be yours as well. I mean, names just right off the bat. You've got Julio Jones, Michael Thomas, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, DJ Moore. There's a lot of great things to dive into, so I really want to save that for the second segment. So this time around, going to start you off with the AFC South. All right, so let's go. Starting off with the Tennessee Titans. So, guys, the Titans, their number one guy from last year is A.J. Brown. He's going somewhere in the mid-teens right now for wide receivers. His ADP is sitting in the 30s. So the reason that Brown is this high, he had a great rookie season last year for starters, but we really saw him take on a larger role when Ryan Tannehill took over that starting quarterback job. He has been a favorite of Tannehill from the beginning. And I think a lot of this actually comes from training camp and practices when Marcus Mariota was still the starter. Ryan Tannehill and A.J. Brown were taking a lot of snaps together on that second team, and they really were able to develop a good chemistry right off the rip. So just to give you an idea of how Brown did last year, 1,051 yards. He had 84 targets and 8 touchdowns, which is crazy efficiency. You might be due for a little bit of touchdown regression, but I think you could also counteract that a little bit with Tannehill playing the entire year. But we know they're going to like to link up quite a bit. And what makes these numbers even more impressive is, again, A.J. Brown was a rookie in 2019. It generally takes a long time for rookies to develop, especially when they're not put right into a high-volume spot right away. For example, I always go back to Jalen Reagor this year with the Eagles. He's got potential to be the number one guy right off the bat in an offense that's going to love to throw the ball a lot. So I can see him having numbers like this. But with A.J. Brown in Tennessee, they were not a pass-happy team last year. They were very balanced. They loved to run the ball with Derrick Henry. And Tannehill, despite his great efficiency numbers, was still not blowing the doors off of anybody with his statistics. So long story short, Brown was one of the most efficient wide receivers in the league last year as a rookie, which is crazy. Now, do I think the efficiency is going to completely hold up? No. 84 targets, 8 touchdowns. I can see the touchdown numbers going up, again, with Tannehill staying longer, but it'll be on more targets. It's not going to be crazy efficient, but I think it's also going to lead to him being a better overall fantasy prospect for you this year. Tannehill has shown us no reason to think that he's going to miss time. He had one season where he was really dealing with a lot of injuries in Miami before they shipped him out. So that said, the biggest danger to A.J. Brown's value is Ryan Tannehill's potential to regress in 2020. Just like Brown, Tannehill was incredibly efficient last year. I understand why people think he's going to take a step back because he hasn't been a world beater. He hasn't been a great quarterback really since he came into the league. However, when you look at the mess that was the Miami Dolphins while Tannehill was still there with Adam Gase running the show, I'm not that surprised that he wasn't being played out to his full potential. So while he's never going to be a top 5 quarterback, I think with the way that the Titans have built their system, he is a great fit for them long term, and I'm not incredibly worried about him regressing. Yes, he's not going to put up crazy numbers, but he's not going to have to for A.J. Brown to be able to retain his value. Now, the Titans are also going to be run-heavy this year. But again, they were run-heavy last year, and he was still able to produce as a rookie. So I do like A.J. Brown. I think wide receiver 12 is about where he needs to be. I don't see him having crazy upside, but I don't see him having a huge chance to bottom out either. He's a solid floor pick with a kind of a limited ceiling, but he's someone that can definitely help you week to week. So now that leads us to the guy on the other side of A.J. Brown. That's going to be Corey Davis, who went into 2019 as the presumed number one receiver in Tennessee. He's sitting all the way at wide receiver 70. His ADP is a solid 140 spots lower than A.J. Brown. Now, I get it. He's the second option on a team that's not going to pass the ball a ton, but let's not forget, guys, Coach Mike Vrabel just last season said that Davis was the most talented receiver that they had, and that was with A.J. Brown on the roster. I believe him when he says that, and I believe they're still going to find a way to utilize him. Now, again, it's not going to be world-breaking. This guy has yet to really break out. He's had 3 years to make a statement in the NFL and hasn't been able to seize the opportunity, and we saw him get outshined by Brown in 2019. I don't see this as a situation where he has the potential to take the number one spot. However, at ADP 195, I'm willing to take a risk on almost any wide receiver 2 in the league, right? This is someone that you're getting in your 14th, 15th round, who could finish with, he's not going to be a fantasy wide receiver 2, but he could be a flex option for you even, at an ADP that's about 2 steps away from just being a flyer pick. So, where Corey Davis gets hurt, again, is there's going to be limited volume here. You've got Ryan Tannehill, you have a run-heavy offense. It's not going to be a situation like Atlanta or Kansas City where there's going to be crazy enough volume to support 1 or 2 top 20 receiving options. But there's going to be enough there to where Corey Davis is at least going to be worth taking the risk on. He's a lottery ticket. You can have hopes of a breakout for him. If something were to happen with A.J. Brown, I think he steps into that role. He's a capable wide receiver. Again, while he might not be elite, he's a body, and he's going to be the beneficiary of targets if something were to happen to Brown. So I like Corey Davis as a very late round flyer. Again, a potential wide receiver 2 in this offense that you're getting at an ADP in almost the 200s right now. So the last guy here worth noting is their slot receiver. That's Adam Humphries. He's sitting about 20 wide receiver spots lower than Davis. He's in the mid-90s. His ADP is almost non-existent. He's up in the 300s. So he did have a top 30 finish just a couple years ago as the slot option for Tampa Bay, and the reason that he went to Tennessee is with the emergence of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. It really looked like he was going to need to find somewhere where he was going to have a bigger role, and that just never really materialized. When he came to Tennessee last year, he finished with just 47 targets, a little under 400 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And what's even more concerning is that his weekly value dropped even more after Ryan Tannehill was introduced into the lineup. So Humphries, even though he's not too far off of a decent finish for you, just not worth drafting at all. I don't really see any breakout potential with him, any lottery value there. So just general, I would avoid Adam Humphries. So moving on, let's talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars. Yes, everyone seems to think the Jaguars are going to be the worst team in the league this year. I don't necessarily disagree with them, but that doesn't mean they don't have some legitimate fantasy options for you. So their number one guy is DJ Chark. He's sitting at about wide receiver 23. His ADP is up in the 50s. So last year, he really broke out with Gardner Minshew taking the helm for the majority of the year. He's able to get 118 targets, 1,000 yards, and then hauled in 8 touchdowns. So a great season, despite the fact that later on, I think it was about week 14, he started dealing with an ankle issue. He missed one game, came back, wasn't quite the same player, but overall solid season for DJ Chark. He will have some competition this year, guys. They have Laviska Shenault, who they drafted relatively early in the 2020 draft. However, as much as I like Shenault, you guys have heard me talk about him before. I like him as a dynasty pick. He is coming off a core muscle injury that he had during the offseason. And on top of that, he already has an extensive injury history. So when you take all of those things into account, and the fact that COVID is really slowing the amount of time that players and teams are able to meet up and go through rehab, check on medicals, things like that, I think that it's going to allow DJ Chark to really fend off Laviska Shenault, especially early in the season, and really be a target hog for the offense. I mentioned that injury before with Chark about week 14. Guys, before he went down with that, he was wide receiver 8. And let me repeat, he had Gardner Minshew as his quarterback, who, while I think he is underrated, is still obviously not an elite quarterback, but he was putting up excellent numbers. Overall, the roster is a mess, and the defense is a mess, and I get why people think they're going to be awful. However, defense is bad. They're going to be slinging the ball around more, and as I mentioned, Minshew's a little bit underrated. He's a great deep ball passer, and that works really well with the style of play that DJ Chark brings. He's going to be able to get down the field, and he's going to be able to come down with contested catches. So I see, even though that team is going to be bad, I see a relatively low floor with Chark. He's still a young developing player, so I think they're going to keep him on the field as much as they can. It's not like the McCaffrey situation where they just pay the guy a ton of money and they need to, protect their asset. So even if the team really starts to tank, look for Chark to be able to get consistent targets throughout the year. So the other player that I mentioned was Laviska Shenault. He is looking about wide receiver 76. His ADP is all the way in the mid-200s right now. And as I mentioned, I do like him in Dynasty. I think he's going to be an excellent wide receiver, and had he not had this injury history coming in, I could have very easily seen him go in the first round right after guys like Jerry Jeudy or CeeDee Lamb. However, we can't ignore it. It's there. The injury history is real. And like I mentioned, the fact that he's not going to have a lot of time to work with the team before the season starts to really get into the system because of COVID, it's really going to take him time to develop. And as I mentioned, rookie wide receivers already usually take longer than other rookie positions to really come into their own and hit their peak. Laviska just has a lot of things working against him from that front. Now, the good news is even though the Jaguars offense had this notion that they were very limited last year, it was still able to support 4 players getting 90 or more targets. So Laviska, if he's starting and if he's healthy, is going to have some good fantasy value for you, but that is the question mark right now. He is in danger to not start right away. But if you do want to take the risk on Laviska Shenault, if you are a fan of the type of player he is, like I am, he's a guy that if you draft him towards the end of your drafts, he's a very easy cut week 1 if he's not out there on the field. Very easy. You're going to know right away, even without having a preseason, if he's not regularly in the lineup, you just cut bait with him and be done with it. Now to the last player of note, that's going to be Dede Westbrook. He's sitting actually slightly higher on the wide receiver rankings than Laviska is right now at wide receiver 71. His ADP is in the late 100s right now. So he is the starting slot guy in Jacksonville. We know that he doesn't have any real competition for that spot right now. He got 101 targets each of the last 2 seasons, exactly 101, which is kind of crazy. However, but what's frustrating about Westbrook is despite the fact that he gets all of these targets, he's yet to really be able to translate that into actual solid fantasy production, right? He's not a big touchdown guy. He doesn't get a ton of yardage out of his catches. He's really limited to just a solid PPR option. So if you can get him late, like I mentioned, I'd like him in PPR. However, for that kind of value where you're sitting before you hit the 200s in ADP, I'd much rather wait a couple rounds and snag somebody like Danny Amendola for Detroit or Cole Beasley at Buffalo, and you can get them almost 50 draft spots later. And even though their target share might be a little bit lower, they're able to do more with their targets, and I think their fantasy values are going to come out pretty even. So if I can get similar production, 50 spots after where you can get Westbrook, I'm obviously going to go for that rather than draft him. So that's it for the Jaguars. Then moving on to Indianapolis. So this is an interesting wide receiver situation they're dealing with right now, where their top guy, at least in my opinion, is one of the least desirable in their system, and that's T.Y. Hilton. Hilton has been a solid fantasy option year in and year out, specifically when he had Andrew Luck as his quarterback. But this year, he's sitting about wide receiver 25 in the rankings. His ADP is up in the 50s. Here's what you have to consider with Hilton. He's 30 years old. We've seen him start to have to regularly deal with injuries the last couple of years. When he is healthy, he produces. He had 1,200 yards when he was able to play 14 games in 2018, but the problem is he can't consistently stay on the field like he used to. And for the first time, he has some real competition for targets there in Indianapolis. And his type of play doesn't mesh as well with Phillip Rivers as the other 2 players on this list, specifically Michael Pittman, who I'll get to here shortly. So there's a lot of risk with how high he's being taken right now. I understand why his ranking is there, because he's had seasons where he's been a number 1 wide receiver, but he dropped off pretty severely in 2019. And a couple other things you want to consider. One, they have an aging quarterback. They have an older quarterback in Phillip Rivers, so he may not be asked to throw the ball nearly as much as Andrew Luck did when he was there. So that's going to limit Hilton from that perspective. And then 2 guys, they're going to run the ball a lot this year. They already have Marlon Mack, who had a solid 2019 campaign. It wasn't, an amazing running back, but he was able to get the job done. He's a solid workhorse guy. And then they go out and draft Jonathan Taylor in the 2nd round. That tells me that they're definitely going to want to be more run-focused in 2020, which makes sense because, as I mentioned, older quarterback, and they have one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. So, of course, you're going to want to pound the rock a little bit more. So there's a lot of things taking away from T.Y. Hilton. If he was a bona fide number 1 in that offense and we knew what his role was going to look like with Phillip Rivers, this ranking might be different. But the competition scares me, and their potential to run the ball a lot more also scares me here. So that brings me then to my number 2. That's Paris Campbell. He's sitting at wide receiver 63. His ADP is almost in the 200s, so you can get him way later than T.Y. Hilton. And the great thing about him is he seems to be a younger version of him, right? They drafted Paris Campbell to be T.Y. Hilton. He's being groomed as a replacement. You can see in the stature, in the speed, the play style, these guys are nearly identical players. Paris Campbell is still just developing a little bit. Now, what makes me nervous with Campbell, and the only reason I don't have him higher than I do, is because as low as I am on Hilton, he's still going to be on the field. He's still going to be part of that offense. And with both these guys playing a similar role, I can see there being real potential for them to kind of cancel each other out. And on top of that, that doesn't mesh incredibly well with Phillip Rivers. Now, if Hilton were to miss some time, which is very possible, I think Campbell jumps up the board quite a bit. At this point in his career, I think Campbell is strong enough to be able to step right into that T.Y. Hilton role. Even though he may not be as good as Hilton was at his peak, he's still serviceable. Now, here's the other side of that. Campbell has also not exactly been the pinnacle of health. He missed 9 games already in his first season. 1 season, he's already missed 9. So he's not, a surefire candidate to be on the field either. So at this point, I'm not super high on Paris Campbell or T.Y. Hilton. However, I am excited about the team moving forward. When Paris Campbell, assuming he's able to stay healthy, develops a little bit more, and Hilton eventually moves off the team, which could be as soon as next year, Paris Campbell and Michael Pittman have the potential to be one of the best young receiving cores in the NFL, which moves me on to Michael Pittman. He is sitting one spot lower than Paris Campbell right now as far as wide receivers go, and his ADP is actually a little bit better. So the experts are really kind of going back and forth on these two guys. They're both very young. Their play styles are completely different, and that's why I actually favor Pittman here a little bit more. I think, as I've been alluding to, I think Michael Pittman's play style just fits a lot better with Rivers than Campbell's does. Now, Pittman is the best contested catch receiver on this team right now, even as a rookie. That's the reason he was drafted as high as he was. He's a big man. He's not going to beat you with speed. He's not going to run the greatest routes in the world, but he's going to go up and haul in passes just off of his physicality, and he has the potential to become a number one receiver in the NFL just off of that ability. He is that good at what he does. And what do we know about Phillip Rivers? Even as he gets older, the dude is a risk taker. He likes to sling the ball down the field, and he's going to need someone reliable to pull passes in that might not be the most accurate in the world, and that is where Michael Pittman is going to shine. On top of being incredibly physical, his catch radius is also pretty incredible, and he can be a favorite of Rivers right off the bat. He can be a safety valve who can get them plays down the field with consistency. I think the Colts are going to want to develop him quickly. As I mentioned, Hilton is likely on his way out after the 2020 season, so Campbell will step into that role. They're going to get Pittman comfortable on the other side of the field this year, and you should be able to see him on the field plenty of times. He's going to be playing all year. I think he has a wide receiver 3 ceiling this year, again, if he's able to really develop that relationship with Phillip Rivers like I think he will. And then as soon as next year, I think that jumps up to a wide receiver 2 ceiling with Hilton out of the picture and with Rivers there for one more year. So I'm really high on Michael Pittman, especially for his ADP, which again is in like 170 to 190 right now, somewhere in there, depending on where you're drafting. Not as high on the other two, but moving forward, I do like Paris Campbell as well, and he should be someone that you're looking at in your dynasty leagues. All right, and last but not least, we have one of the more divisive wide receiver rooms in fantasy right now, and that is the Houston Texans. We all know DeAndre Hopkins was shipped out of there for a bag of peanuts and David Johnson, which opens up at minimum 150 targets for this offense. You've got Deshaun Watson at quarterback. He's going to have somebody there that's going to break out in his receiving core. The real question is it Will Fuller? Is it Brandon Cooks? So here's my take on each of these guys. They are right next to each other in the wide receiver rankings. ADP is also flipped, so just like I was saying with Pittman and Campbell, the experts are really split on these guys down the middle. So I'll start with Will Fuller. He's sitting at about wide receiver 35. And just to look ahead a little, Cooks is at 36. So one of these guys is going to be a number one receiver in fantasy this year, and you're going to be able to get them in rounds, 5, 6, 7, right? So one of these guys is really going to pay off for you. So Will Fuller, I think this would be a much easier conversation if Fuller could stay on the field. That's a big if, guys, right? If I could guarantee he was going to play 14 games for me this year, then he would be my pick hands down. He's got game-breaking speed. He's the most talented wide receiver on the team, but he's already missed 19 games in 4 years. And that's not even telling the whole story. There have been plenty of instances where Will Fuller has played injured, which I think is part of what has really lent to this boom or bust persona that he's really kind of taken on. There's going to be 1 year where Will Fuller plays all 16 games and he finishes as a top 5 wide receiver. But I don't know when that's going to be. And I don't feel comfortable enough at this point to really be betting on him to stay on the field as much as he needs to. Now, when he is playing, he's still going to be boom or bust. He is a little bit big play dependent. Like I said, he's a speedster. He's a down-the-field kind of guy. Another thing he has going for him, he does have some chemistry with Deshaun Watson, and that'll help him over someone like Cooks a little bit because there's not going to be as much of an offseason for him to get introduced. But the one thing we know about Brandon Cooks is that he's perfectly fine getting bounced from team to team. So let's move into him now. Like I said, just one spot lower than Will Fuller right now in the consensus wide receiver rankings. In my opinion, he's the safer of the two options. He's had some injury issues, but he's only missed about 8 games in 6 years, and 6 of those came in his rookie season. As I had mentioned, he's already produced for 3 different teams. It hasn't been a case where he has to step in and there's an adjustment period. No, like, he was great in New Orleans where he was drafted. When he was in New England, he produced right away, and then we also saw him play a crucial part with that Rams offense when they were in the Super Bowl just a couple of years ago. Now, the reason I think people are a little lower on Cooks coming into this season is not only the team change, but the Rams were a mess in 2019, and that really brought his value down. People think that he regressed a little bit, but I think that was a lot more because of the Rams' offensive line and the fact that they really struggled to find their identity, and not nearly as much about Cooks himself. Again, 72 targets, 583 yards, 2 touchdowns. That's not like him at all. Before that, he had 4 1,000-yard seasons in a row. So this was an anomaly, a lot more on the Rams than it is on him. So, and on top of that, he was still producing when he was competing with Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp, who are legitimate fantasy options year in and year out. So everything taken into account here, Cooks is a solid wide receiver who's going to be on the field, and I think that is good enough for Watson to latch on to him, and I believe he's going to be the breakout guy in this Texans offense. It's not to say that Will Fuller's not going to have value, but when all is said and done, Cooks' wide receiver ranking is going to shoot way up, and Fuller's is going to end up dropping here. So give me shares of Brandon Cooks over Will Fuller. This is something I actually changed my mind on, guys. I was higher on Will Fuller when this all started, but the more I look into the injury history, the more that worries the crap out of me. So I like Brandon Cooks a ton in this offense. So 2 other guys actually still worth mentioning with the Texans. They do have Randall Cobb this year, who they brought in. He is a slot target hog. He's a guy that has PPR value like a lot of other players that I've mentioned, and his ADP is somewhere in the mid-200s right now. He's got minimal competition out of that slot role. It's a role that we know Watson is still going to like to go to. He does have a little bit of limited touchdown potential. He's never been a high touchdown guy, but he could still nab 90-plus targets. Like I said, with Hopkins leaving, there are targets opening up all over the field. Cobb will definitely be a recipient of that, and because of that, he's going to have good PPR production. And this also may come as a shock to you guys. A lot of people think that Randall Cobb is kind of on his last leg, that he's getting old. He's only 29. I didn't believe that. I had to double check it. I thought he was somewhere in his mid-30s. It feels like he's been in the league since I've been alive, but no. 29 years old, and he's still going to be able to produce plenty for you. Cobb has a lot left in the tank. And then finally, guys, Kenny Stills. He is sitting a couple spots lower than Randall Cobb. He's 28 years old. Kenny Stills is only a year younger than Randall Cobb, which, again, is still blowing my mind. Kenny Stills, I think his only real value is where injuries are going to start happening. He's going to step into one of these bigger roles. And don't get me wrong, given the players on this team, there is some real potential for injury. But until that happens, Stills is going to be very limited. At best, he's someone you can stash at the end of your bench for when players start to go down. But he's not someone that you would want to bet on week in and week out by any means. So that is it, guys. That is the AFC South. When we come back, I'm going to take a look at the NFC South wide receiver room. Again, I'm so excited to go through these guys. A ton of talent in that division. And then, of course, stick around for the end of the show as I give you my top 10 late-round PPR targets. You've heard me talk about them a little bit this episode and the last couple. Guys that you can get in, late 100s to 200s of ADP that are going to be able to get you solid value just by being target vacuums. So you are listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be right back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. As you heard last segment, just took a look at the AFC South wide receiver room. Now, if for some reason you're jumping into the middle of this podcast, do not worry. I did switch the AFC and NFC segments this time around. I usually do the NFC first. Decided to get the AFC out of the way because no offense to them, but there is not another wide receiver division that holds a candle to the NFC South. So let's get into it. We'll start with the consensus number one wide receiver in fantasy for 2020 with the New Orleans Saints. That is Michael Thomas. As I mentioned, wide receiver 1, his ADP is somewhere between picks 3 and 6, depending on the type of approach that you're taking. I did a segment about how Thomas isn't the clear-cut number 1. There is opportunity for him to lose that spot throughout the year. However, all things considered, guys, he is the number 1 option for fantasy in 2020 when it comes to your receiver. Now, the magic number here, guys, is 67. 67 points is the number of points that Thomas finished ahead of the wide receiver 2 last season. That is insane. That is multiple games of number 1 wide receiver numbers ahead of the second best guy in the league. On top of that, in 2020, he's got limited competition. Michael Thomas is the clear wide receiver 1 there, even with Emmanuel Sanders on the team now. I don't see him taking a lot of targets away from Michael Thomas, especially with Drew Brees still at the helm. Now, that is the only real place where I see there being a potential hang-up. Drew Brees has declined steadily the last few years, even though people don't really want to admit it. We don't see it as much early season, but his arm starts to wear on him as the season goes on. He's not able to push the ball down the field quite as much. Now, the good news is Michael Thomas is used a lot more in the short to intermediate game. So the good news is even if Brees does start to decline a little bit, he should still be utilized a lot. I don't think he's going to drop off a ton even if Brees does. Where the issue comes in is if Brees is to get hurt again, or if he plays so poorly that they do have to move on from him mid-season, having Jameis Winston in there might hurt him a little bit more. Winston, we know, can support multiple number 1 receivers. However, when you look at Thomas, who is a real guy that benefits from Brees' accuracy and his just sniper-like approach, and you switch him out with Winston, who is just a blazing free kind of gunslinger type of quarterback, there is some potential for Thomas's value to drop off there. But I'm not predicting that Brees is going to go down, but as he ages, it is something that you at least have to think about. Again, not enough for you to not consider him as the number 1 receiver in fantasy this year. So again, just to show you how good Michael Thomas is, his stats from last season, 1,725 yards, which is insane. There might be a little regression there. That's neither here nor there. 9 touchdowns, 149 targets. Now, you might also look at that and think, well, 9 touchdowns, he's probably due for some regression there. That's relatively high for a wide receiver, even as the clear-cut number 1 guy in his team. Not the case, guys. 2016, 9 touchdowns. 2017, 5 touchdowns. 2018, 9 touchdowns. 2019, 9 touchdowns. Guys, he is a scoring machine. Talent-wise, I can't tell you that I think he's the most talented wide receiver in the NFL, but he is the most valuable to his team, and he has a very, very low floor and an incredible ceiling. So love Michael Thomas as the number 1 guy this year. I did mention Emmanuel Sanders, who's going to be on the other side of him. He is sitting about wide receiver 43. His ADP is up in the low 100s. With Sanders, you got to think this is his 3rd team now in literally a year. He went from Denver to San Francisco on a trade last year. San Francisco decided not to keep him and has already moved into New Orleans. He's also 33 years old, which I did not realize. 4 years older than Randall Cobb. It does not feel like Emmanuel Sanders has been in the league that long. So despite all of this, he has still put up some reliable numbers the last few seasons. He's not a steady fantasy option, but he does have plenty left in the tank here still. Now, he will be lost behind Michael Thomas. This isn't going to be a situation, even like Atlanta, that I'm going to talk about, where while Brees is talented, Thomas is utilized so much that I don't see him really supporting a second solid fantasy option. He's going to get lost there. So he might have a breakout week or two because Sanders still has the talent, and it is a high-powered offense, but Michael Thomas is so rooted in this offense at this point that it's going to be tough for Sanders to get a really big share. And again, the same things I've been talking about for all players that are arriving in new teams. COVID has limited the ability for players to get involved in the offseason programs and to really take in their offenses as a whole. So, as I said, he'll have a breakout week or two. He's going to get a lot of value if Michael Thomas goes down. He hasn't really shown us that that's something we have to worry about, but you could see him really shoot all the way up to like a fantasy wide receiver 2 at that point. But overall, not really big on Emmanuel Sanders this year. Also, guys, as I mentioned, with Breeze getting a little bit older, they do have Alvin Kamara still. So Kamara is not only going to take away a lot of those wide receiver 2 targets, but they're going to be running the ball with him a lot this year. I think their offense will shift a little bit. Even Latavius Murray is a solid backup. They're going to utilize their backs a lot more, and that's just going to take a little bit more away from Emmanuel Sanders. So last guy worth mentioning, that's Tre'Quan Smith. He's sitting at about wide receiver 86. His ADP is in the late 200s right now. I'm not really big on him, guys. He's only seen 69 targets in 26 games in the NFL so far, and that was even before Emmanuel Sanders had arrived. He's going to see the field just because of the way that New Orleans likes to line up. They like to spread the field a little bit. However, his value is extremely limited. The one thing that people attach to with him is that he does have a surprising touchdown total. He's had 10 touchdowns in those 26 games, so maybe he has some value in best ball or even as a value pick if you're doing daily fantasy, but I'm avoiding him altogether in any kind of standard, dynasty, any of those kind of drafts. Tre'Quan Smith, he's had his opportunities, he just hasn't really made anything of them. So it's Michael Thomas, guys, and it's everybody else in that offense. Next up, guys, is my favorite 1-2 punch from a receiving core, even more than Tampa Bay, who we'll talk about later on. But guys, that's the Atlanta Falcons. Starting with Julio Jones. He is currently, with the consensus rankings, the wide receiver 4. His ADP is around 14. And in my opinion, he's the number 2 receiver in fantasy this year. He's incredibly consistent, guys. From 2014 to 2019, his worst season for yardage was last year, and he still almost broke 1,400 yards. And the least amount of touchdowns he had, which was an anomaly, was 2017, where he had 3. And he was playing through injury and being used as a decoy for a lot of that year. Look at the guys in front of him. Devontae Adams, you guys know my opinion on him. You've got Tyreek Hill there as well, who he may finish with more fantasy points than Julio at the end of the season. There's a real possibility for that. However, when I'm drafting a receiver this high, I'll take consistency over boom or bust play week in and week out. It might be great that Tyreek Hill finishes with more points at the end of the year, but if it's at the cost of having games where he's only getting 3 or 4 points and then other games where he's getting 30, I would much rather have the guy that's scoring me 15 to 20 points every week and I can rely on. Tyreek Hill is going to end up losing you some weeks because he's just not going to be utilized to his full potential. Julio Jones, you're not going to have to worry about that. On top of all of this, guys, we know Atlanta's going to love to pass the ball a ton. He's also got Calvin Ridley, who I'm about to mention here, on the other side of him. And the benefit of having a player over there of Ridley's caliber is that defenses are not going to be able to cheat coverage over to Julio. Calvin Ridley is too good and is going to end up burning teams if they're going to try to bracket Julio and double cover him. So that's going to leave both of these guys open enough to do what they're able to do best. And he is 33. Some people are a little concerned about that, but he's really shown no signs of regression. Even at 33 years old, Julio Jones is still the gift that keeps on giving, guys. So I love Julio this year. Calvin Ridley, who I just mentioned, he is actually pretty high now. He has continued to climb throughout the rankings. When I first started paying attention to Ridley, he was still sitting in the 20s for wide receiver rankings this year. He's all the way up to 16 among the expert consensus. So I think he's the best wide receiver 2 in fantasy football. As I mentioned, I like this core even more than Tampa Bay. I think he's going to finish with better numbers than Mike Evans even. He's on track for 120 targets even as the wide receiver 2 in this offense. And on top of that, he's been crazy efficient his first 2 years in the league. He has 17 touchdowns off of 185 catches. Not targets, guys. Catches, right? He's been super efficient. He's got Matt Ryan there too, guys, who has proven that he can maintain 2 top-tier wide receivers. He's had 2 guys in the top 24 4 different times. The only other quarterback that's been able to do that was Aaron Rodgers. And you don't often hear those two mentioned in the same ilk, but Matt Ryan might not be winning MVP year in and year out. He's taken his team to 1 Super Bowl. I guess Rodgers has too. Wow, that's kind of crazy to think about. But regardless, he's going to put up enough passing volume to really support both of these players. And on top of that, Mohamed Sanu's gone. Mohamed Sanu was being utilized in this offense quite a bit as a slot guy, so his targets are now vacated for the full year, so there is really no competition behind either Calvin Ridley or Julio Jones. So Calvin Ridley can put up borderline wide receiver 1 fantasy numbers, even as the second guy on his team. I am very high on this Atlanta offense this year, even if the team may not be great as a whole. So last guy, I'm just going to mention him, is Russell Gage. He's only in the top 100 for wide receiver consensus, I believe, because of this offense. He has the potential for some production, but the guys in front of him are just too talented to really be betting on him as any kind of regular fantasy threat. The only places I really see Russell Gage draftable is in 14 to 16 team leagues, like really deep leagues, guys, because he'll get you a couple points at the end of your lineup that you'll need. He's not boomer busty enough to be a good best ball pick. He's not young enough and promising enough to be a good dynasty pick. So he's got very limited potential. Again, only a guy I'm targeting if I've got an incredibly deep redraft league. All right, next is by far the best wide receiver grouping from 2019, and that's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Chris Godwin is just a couple spots ahead of Mike Evans right now. When you talk about expert consensus, I actually do agree with them here. He's about wide receiver 6. His ADP is between 16 and 18. So I think his ranking's about right here at wide receiver 6. He broke out in 2019. Great year. 121 targets, 1,300 yards, 9 touchdowns, and all of this behind a crazy year from Jameis Winston, where he was able to support 2 top 5 guys and still somehow managed to throw 30 interceptions and finish with the most yards in the league. It's a very taboo type deal with him. So what do we know about Tom Brady now? Winston's replacement. He's not going to sling the ball for 5,000 yards. That's not how he is. He's also not going to take as many risks. He's not going to throw as many interceptions, but he does love his slot receivers. Just looking at what he was able to do with Julian Edelman, and he averaged about 150 targets a year with Brady. And when I look at Chris Godwin, he's younger, he's faster, and he's stronger than Edelman. He's overall a better wide receiver. So I think Tom Brady's going to be foaming at the mouth when he gets down to Tampa and is able to utilize him as a true slot weapon. I like this a lot. Now, the one downside with Brady, while I still think he's going to be able to lead his team to what I think is going to be a Super Bowl appearance this year, he's never really produced enough passing volume to carry 2 elite wide receivers. So the fact that they've got Mike Evans and Chris Godwin both still ranked that high, I think is a mistake, because one of them is bound to drop off, and the more I look into it, I really think it's going to be Mike Evans, right? I mean, even if Brady takes a step back this year as he continues to get older, which he could, he's 42, I mean, Chris Godwin is still going to be a safe option for him. He's going to be that short to intermediate slot target that he likes to work with. Mike Evans, a little more nervous about. I think he's a real candidate to regress with Brady now in charge here. Brady does not sling the ball like Jameis Winston does. Like, we've already been over this. Assuming that Brady really does like to go to Godwin, there's just not going to be a ton of targets left for Mike Evans to produce off of. Now, what Evans does have going for him is even with Jameis Winston and some of the other subpar quarterbacks they've had there in Tampa Bay, he's had 6 straight 1,000-yard seasons. But he is also inconsistent from game to game. He's very touchdown reliant, which worked with Jameis Winston from time to time, but still he was not able to get you amazing value game in and game out. Now, with him being a veteran, I mean, Brady's still going to rely on him, but because of that touchdown dependency, I think his big play production is going to be limited with Tom Brady as opposed to Jameis Winston. I mean, Brady's not going to find Evans way down the field. He's not going to be able to push the ball like that. So that's going to hurt Evans a little bit too. So Mike Evans, it's frustrating because he's still a good receiver. I don't want you guys to think that he's not. He's only 26 years old. He's been consistent from a yardage standpoint since he's been in the league. But, again, with Tom Brady coming in, he can't support both of these guys. I think all the signs are pointing to him really relying on Godwin more. And I can realistically see Mike Evans dropping 4 or 5 fantasy spots and finish right behind a guy like Calvin Ridley. So that's my whole thing on Evans. I like Godwin a lot. I'm going to be drafting him. Wide receiver 6, again, is about right. I wouldn't say to go reach for him, but a guy like Evans, man, take a risk on him a little bit later. But wide receiver 8 is just way too high for me right now. Only other guys worth mentioning on the team, they've got Tyler Johnson and Justin Watson. These guys are just undraftable, and it's got nothing to do with them, but the 2 guys in front of them are just too talented. We know that Godwin and Evans are going to be the real focal point of the offense. We know that Brady has a limited ceiling when it comes to his passing production, like I just mentioned. And then when it comes to the 3rd or 4th receiving options, they're going to be looking at guys like Gronk and O.J. Howard, who we know Tom Brady traditionally likes to target as tight ends. Those guys are going to be utilized a lot more than either Johnson or Watson, so I really don't see any fantasy value for either of them in 2020. All right, guys, last team for this episode, and that is the Carolina Panthers. They have a clear number 1 option right now. That's DJ Moore. He's sitting about wide receiver 15. His ADP is in the 50s. So he is the clear-cut number 1 guy in Carolina. There's no question about that. I like Curtis Samuel. I like Robbie Anderson, but neither of them are real competition to take that number 1 spot. But I'm not as high on him as a lot of the experts are. I'm actually kind of confused about it. I'm fading him quite a bit, and it's got nothing to do with him and a lot more to do with Teddy Bridgewater. Bridgewater is good enough to succeed on good teams. We saw it in Minnesota when they had a great run game, an excellent offense. We saw it in New Orleans where they had Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara, a great offensive line, and a solid defense. He's now going to Carolina, and Carolina has issues. Carolina is going to be playing from behind a lot. And with how limited Bridgewater is as a passer, that's really going to hurt him. And I think he's going to make a lot of mistakes this year. And all of these things are just piling on to where it really feels like Carolina is just going to end up tanking very early. On top of that, we know they're going to be run heavy as well. They've got Christian McCaffrey out of the backfield, and McCaffrey's also going to eat up a ton of targets, which Bridgewater, I think, is going to utilize quite a bit because, as we know, he's not a great down-the-field passer. I mean, people are saying, and by people, I mean fantasy experts that I also read and listen to and break down, they're saying he's a lock for 130 targets, but guys, I just don't see it. Yes, he's the number 1 guy, but Bridgewater is not going to be slinging the ball around this much, right? Even when they are playing from behind, they're going to rely on McCaffrey a lot, and this team just has the potential to fall into a complete mess and to just fall apart in 2020. I'm projecting him more into the mid-20s this year, and I think he'll improve when they do get a guy like Justin Fields or Trevor Lawrence in 2020, and he can be utilized properly, but I'm just not sold on the team as a whole enough to be drafting DJ Moore as a top 15 wide receiver right now. It's unfortunate. Again, I like the guy, but he's going to be limited as a product of the system that he's currently in right now. So other guys to talk about, we got Curtis Samuel. He's sitting at wide receiver 53, and then Robbie Anderson sitting about 57. Their ADPs are flipped, so these are 2 guys that are kind of going back and forth between what the public thinks and then what the experts think. But I'll start with Samuel. So Samuel has yet to really break out, right? And Carolina just spent $20 million to bring in Robbie Anderson. If Curtis Samuel was part of their big plans going forward, right, I don't think they would have spent that much to bring Anderson in here. Samuel's talented, he's a flexible player, and he works great for that offense, but from a fantasy standpoint, he just doesn't do anything quite well enough to bring in fantasy points year in and year out. I mean, he's only racked up about 1,200 receiving yards now in 3 years. And on top of that, losing Cam Newton and then losing Allen, and then we're going to bring in Teddy Bridgewater instead and add Robbie Anderson as competition, it's only going to end up lowering his value. So I'm really not big on Curtis Samuel at all this year. And then there's Robbie Anderson, who's just a couple spots lower than him right now from a consensus standpoint. I'm projecting him to get the second most wide receiver targets on the team. Still going to be limited because he won't get as many targets as Christian McCaffrey, obviously. But the Panthers did invest in him, guys. They invested $20 million into Robbie Anderson. And on top of that, he's already got a relationship with head coach Matt Rule. He played under Rule when he was at Temple just a few years ago. So Rule knew that he wanted Anderson. He went out and got him right away. And that makes me think that he has a carved-out role in this offense already. And on top of all this, he's had consistent wide receiver 2 production the last 3 seasons, even with, at best, suspect quarterback play that they've had up there in New York. So everything's really just adding up for me right now. I honestly think that Robbie Anderson will be the number 2 option in this offense. Again, still limited, because you got Teddy Bridgewater and you've got Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore already eating up targets for you. But if you need some late round consistent production, Robbie Anderson, I think, is a nice choice for you. And I'm really not touching Curtis Samuel at all. Again, it's frustrating. I love watching him play, but he doesn't do anything quite well enough to fully take on that second wide receiver role. So there you have it, guys. That is the AFC and NFC South wide receiver rooms. I love a lot of what I see out of the NFC South this year. There's going to be tons of fantasy production, and there's potential to have, the top 3 wide receivers could realistically all come out of the NFC South this year. So that's the breakdown for today's episode. When we come back, we're going to wrap it up. One more segment for you guys as I go over my top 10 late round PPR fantasy targets for you. Guys that are going to be target hogs that fantasy players are not going to necessarily be locking in on, and players that you can rely on at the end of your roster to bring you just a little bit of value despite how low they're going. You are listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, and we'll be right back.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome into the final segment of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. Covered plenty for you today. Started off the show talking about the Jamal Adams trade, the fact that Dalvin Cook more than likely going to be showing up to training camp next week. Answered your 5 burning fantasy questions, got into the AFC and NFC South wide receiver rooms, and finally going to end it all with our top 10. This episode, it is the top 10 late PPR targets. So these are guys that specifically in your PPR league, you're going to be able to get some real value out of, even though their ADP is sub 200. Whether that's because they are good lottery tickets with crazy upside, or there are actually some people on this list, some players on this list that are going to be able to give you consistent value even though their ADP is super high. So let's get it going right away, guys. Number 10, guy I talked about a little earlier in this episode, it's Russell Gage. He is on this list specifically because his ADP is so high. If you don't remember, he is the 3rd wide receiver for the Atlanta Falcons. His ADP is 307 right now. And while he's not going to have a ton of value for you in your standard 12-team league, if you are running 14 to 16 teams, he is someone that you could plug in as a flex guy, and you know he's going to be able to get you at least a few points every week. He's also going to be a factor in daily fantasy because he will have good matchups where he's not going to blow the doors off of anybody. I don't necessarily like him in best ball, but he's going to be able to get you good production for how low of a price you're going to be able to snag him for. So Russell Gage is number 10 for me. Number 9 is Lynn Bowden. He is the wide receiver, running back, quarterback, whatever you want to call him, for the Las Vegas Raiders. His ADP currently sitting at 249. Now, he's a guy that I like because he reminds me a lot of what Antonio Gibson is going to potentially do for Washington, which, if you're wondering, he's not on this list because his ADP was 194, but he's just an offensive weapon that they're going to be able to plug in all around the field. Even if they can't find one distinct job for him in 2020, he's going to still get touches as a running back. He's going to get targeted as a wide receiver. He's going to be utilized quite a bit. So I feel like Lynn Bowden has crazy upside, especially where you're able to get him right now. 249, that's at the very back end of draft. So if you're looking for a nice little lottery ticket, big fan of Lynn Bowden there. Now, number 8, I had to double take when I saw his ADP, but it is accurate. And this is Demarcus Robinson for the Chiefs. His ADP is 414, so he's basically undrafted. Demarcus Robinson is tied to the best offense in the NFL, right? So week in and week out, he might get a couple targets. I don't see him being a huge factor with the guys in front of him, but the minute that any one of those receivers goes down, Robinson's value just skyrockets. And you've got guys like Sammy Watkins on that team that have a extensive injury history. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Robinson get significant touches at some point this year. So, again, ADP 414, grab him in the last round and just stash this guy. He's going to be able to get some excellent value for you. Number 7, another guy I talked about a little bit earlier, that's Corey Davis, the wide receiver for the Tennessee Titans. Guys, this is a number 2 wide receiver that's going at ADP 236. And I get it. I made a lot of the points that this is a run-first offense, and he's not going to be utilized nearly as much as, the big-name second wide receivers like Calvin Ridley, like Mike Evans. Nothing like that, don't get me wrong. But he's still the number 2 guy. He's still going to be playing nearly every snap, and there is real value in that. 236 is still pretty freaking low for Corey Davis, and I'm willing to take the risk on him at that point. There's still even a very small chance that he takes over the number 1 spot because we know Mike Vrabel likes him. So while it's an outside chance, I think he's worth taking a risk, and while you're waiting for him to potentially blow up, he's still going to be able to get you some points if you need to start him from week to week. Number 6, guy you've heard me talk about plenty, that's Mohamed Sanu, the wide receiver for New England. His ADP just 1 spot lower, actually, than Corey Davis. Somebody has to break out as a receiver in this New England offense. And while Julian Edelman is the favorite right now, I think Sanu as a slot guy is going to play a little bit better to what Cam Newton is going to want to do. And I'm just not convinced that Edelman is going to be able to produce without Tom Brady. He's limited in a lot of different ways as a wide receiver, and he just fit the system really well with what Brady wanted to do, and that led him to be very highly targeted, very highly used, but I think everyone's going to regress to the mean a little bit, and I think that's going to allow Mohamed Sanu to really produce even at his ridiculously low ADP right now. So number 5, another guy that I talked about, I guess not this episode, it's a couple episodes ago now, but that's Devin Funchess, the wide receiver for Green Bay. His ADP is 269, and the reason that he's on this list is because he has a real chance to take over that second wide receiver spot. It's kind of wide open right now in Green Bay. Adam Lazard seems like he has it right now, but Funchess being a veteran and being a solid fantasy receiver, just 2 years ago, might just grant him the opportunity to really click with Aaron Rodgers. And if that happens and he grabs that number 2 spot, then you're talking about his ADP, specific or finishing about 100 spots higher than his ADP is right now. So I like Devin Funchess there as another lottery ticket type guy. All right, so this next player, the only non-wide receiver on this list, and it is O.J. Howard, the tight end for Tampa Bay. His ADP is 232, and that is because Rob Gronkowski is in front of him, and we know that Brady loves to work with Gronk. But I think you're going to see both guys utilized in 2020 Coach Arians is going to use any talent that he has on the team. And then on top of that, Gronk, we don't know what he's going to look like after taking a year off. And before that, he was always injury prone. He would miss multiple games a year. I'm not sure that's something that just goes away even with a year of rest. So as soon as that happens and O.J. Howard is the number one tight end in that offense, again, his value just absolutely skyrockets. And you could be getting a top 3 tight end in the league at, again, ADP 232. You could fly him. He's going undrafted in some instances. So I like O.J. Howard there at number 4. Now my last 3 guys are going to be all players that don't have that lottery ticket type of feel to them, but these are all guys that can produce week in and week out, specifically as slot receivers here, and you're going to get points for basically nothing. So my number 3 guy is Cole Beasley. You've heard me talk about him already, the slot receiver for Buffalo. His ADP is at 219 right now. I feel like all of the receivers in Buffalo are going to be utilized pretty evenly. Beasley has already been commanding just under 100 targets, even with John Brown in front of him. I don't see that changing a lot with Stephon Diggs because, again, while he's a very talented wide receiver, I think his targets are going to be limited just because of the way that he plays the game. So Cole Beasley at a sub-200 ADP, you know he's going to have targets available there for him. You know Josh Allen likes to utilize some of the underneath routes because he's not the most accurate quarterback in the world. So he needs that little bit of a safety valve. So I love Cole Beasley at 3. Number 2, Danny Amendola. His ADP, guys, is 281. And in that Lions offense, even without Matt Stafford, was able to command about 95 targets. So with Stafford coming back and them not adding any real receiving pieces, I don't see any reason that Amendola can't repeat that, if not produce, a little bit more with a more talented quarterback. The injury risk is there for him, but he's kind of fended it off the last couple of seasons, so assuming that he can stay healthy, Amendola at ADP 281 could realistically get you some solid flex numbers week in and week out. And then last guy, guys, I talked about him today. It's Randall Cobb. He is tied to an excellent offense there in Houston. Again, their slot guy. With Hopkins gone, it opens up a ton of targets for this offense. And you're going to see Will Fuller and Brandon Cooks really fight over that number 1 receiver spot. But Randall Cobb doesn't have any real competition for where he's playing, and he's undoubtedly going to be the beneficiary of some of those targets opening up. I can realistically see him getting 110-plus targets out of the slot position this year, especially if David Johnson doesn't work out the way they hope in the running game and they have to start throwing the ball more. So Cobb has amazing built-in value. I cannot believe his ADP is as low as it is. I'm going to be definitely getting plenty of shares of Randall Cobb in 2020, and he is my number 1 late-round PPR target. So again, thank you guys for tuning in. I really hope you enjoyed the show today. A lot of great content for you. Make sure you tune in next episode as we break down the AFC and NFC West wide receiver rooms. And then after that, just like we did with the running backs, going to give you my top 30 fantasy wide receivers for 2020. So thank you guys for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Podcast Network. I wanted to ask you, please remember to subscribe to the show. We are on any form of social media that you can find, and leave a nice review wherever you're listening, guys. Any kind of feedback is going to help us bring you a better podcast. So again, follow us on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, any of those social media platforms. Let us know what you think. And as always, thank you guys, have a good night, and take it easy.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.